We've got three familiar speakers with us today. We have Beth Sanner from the Appalachian Regional Commission. She'll be talking about ARC's broadband funding mechanisms and project types that can be applied for. Then we'll move on to Tom Reid from Reid Consulting. He'll give us an update on BEAD and the latest developments there. And then lastly, we'll hear from Schill from NDIA, who will give us an overview of NDIA's Digital Equity Act program funding opportunities. All right, to get us started, I'll ask Beth to take the mic and walk us through some of the ARC funding mechanisms and requirements. We'd also like you to cover opportunities that might be open into the next year and any tips you have for grantees who might be interested in pursuing ARC funding and what that funding can cover. Thanks, Beth.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. Appreciate it. Thanks everybody for joining today, and I hope that this isn't too redundant of a PowerPoint presentation for us. So a little bit about ARC. We'll talk a little bit about ARC just in general as a organization, and then we'll discuss some of the further more nuanced aspects of our funding opportunities here. So ARC, or the Appalachian Regional Commission, or just the Commission, is a regional economic development agency that represents a partnership of state, federal, and local governments. This is a really important aspect of ARC, and I think that it's kind of different than other agencies and other federal entities, and that we are essentially a representative of the states that we work with. So there's no funding opportunities that happen without their consent. So given that we are a part of 13 different states, it's really great to get familiar with the areas that we serve and the individuals that work with us on behalf of the commission within your states. Next slide, please. So ARC broadband funding, part of ARC's initiative for just economic development in general is broadband. We have really come to understand the necessity of equitable and accessible broadband across our Appalachian territories, and its foundation in allowing for economic development is a key part of what we do. So ARC has a couple of different funding mechanisms that can be used to apply for broadband projects in general. And understanding those different funding mechanisms is important to understand the different rules and regulations surrounding them. So at a really high level, ARC funds broadband activities through three different sources of programs, so funding throughout those different programs. It's really helpful to understand that Power and Arise are both newer types of programs, Arise being the newest, and Power coming about in about 2017 is, I believe, when we first got congressional appropriations for that specific funding pool. And area development has been part of the funding mechanism since the commission was instituted in 1965. So looking at Power, it is explicitly for coal-impacted communities, and that can mean a variety of different things, right? Economic disadvantages, or just looking at how coal has been in those areas and the traditional sense that they have allowed for those communities to thrive in the past, and what that looks like now. So it could be, like I said, in an economic and education, it could be health, it could be a number of different ways in which we've seen those communities suffer as a result of the coal economic activities leaving those communities. So that is Power, and it is on a year-by-year basis. So we typically will look at what we are going to be funded for Power in the middle of the year. We start seeing what the congressional appropriations are going to be. And so far, we've seen that they are planning to allocate another $65 million for fiscal year 2025 for Power, but we do not have that approval yet. So we can't really roll out the NOSA or the guidelines for it until we see that congressional approval. Once we do have it approved, then you will start seeing more information come along in our website and through our emails. So keep an eye out for that. We don't expect it to deviate too much from what we have had in the past years. So for planning activities, about 50,000 max. And for implementation or broadband deployment projects or construction projects, they can all mean different things. We don't necessarily mean construction is the only type of implementation projects, but implementation of broadband is about a 2.5 million max. Arise is funded from the IIJA, and we have allocated about 200 million each year for that. And I believe 2022 was the first year that we had rolled it out. So 2023 was when we had our first funding pool actually going. So an Arise applicant that was successful would be in Connect Humanity. So they were one of our first applicants that was awarded programs funding from that. So that one is a multi-state project only. So you have to be able to put together projects that will impact many states or many areas throughout a couple different states, however you want to look at it, but it has to be multi-state projects. And the planning for that is a $500,000 max, and then implementation is about 10 million max. We don't have the NOSA out for that yet, but we do expect that the funding for that will be similar to what it was last year. We might have some different tweaks in it, but I'll talk about that in a minute. So area development are the traditional broadband funding pools and mechanisms that we have had in the past since we have began as a commission. And all of the ARC, area development grant proposals, must originate at the state level with the state program manager, meaning every state has their own strategic plan and their own timeline in which they submit their applications to ARC. So if you were interested in applying for area development grants, you would really need to get in touch with your state program manager. And there's a link in that section there. So that's underlined the state program manager. That's actually an active link. And these will be sent out to you afterwards. So please utilize those resources. All construction projects, and this is also another thing that makes ARC a little bit unique here, is that we don't administer any construction projects since we don't have the capacity or the expertise or that kind of knowledge base that other federal agencies might have. So all of our construction projects have to be administered through a basic agency. So in order to come up with a construction project, you would have to work with a basic agency as well and make sure that they are willing to administer that project on behalf of you as the grantee. And next slide, please. So a little bit more about Power and Arise, since we do have a lot more questions typically coming in about broadband funding from those two pools, Power in particular. So our funding, again, for this is contingent on congressional approval. We are anticipating a similar amount from 2024, which was that 65 million. If you are interested in seeing what the projects that were funded this year through Power will be, stay tuned. We should be making our announcements in the next month. So we should have everything rolling out by October. And so hopefully we should know by the end of the year what our congressional allotment for Power for next year will be. And then again, in the beginning of the year, you should be able to find out all of the specifics for Power for broadband funding. And so Arise, since we already do have the funding allocated for it, we already know what our funding pool is going to be, that 200 million. But we have not released our new NOSA, and we are working and planning actively right now for the next phase of Arise, and intends to release that NOSA in the near future. Hopefully within the next few months, we should have some information on that. Since I'm not on the Arise team, I can't really give any more specifics, but I did talk with our program manager there, and they do anticipate that happening in the near future. The application process will be outlined in its NOSA, and those for the possible processes that will be updated will be outlined in that NOSA. But they said that the concept paper from last year still provides a good framework for things that any potential grantees or applicants should be thinking about now. So looking at your geographic scope, your budget, your partnerships, project descriptions, activities, et cetera. All of that should still be relevant information and very helpful in guiding some information for the development of those types of projects. And that link right there goes to the concept paper template from last year that is still useful in that development. I'm sorry, I just saw one question. I want to make sure I get it. So are each of the three funding areas eligible for BAS? Quick answer, yes. But I can talk a little bit more about that. So we're going to talk about broadband as a service now, and then I can probably answer that a little bit better. So Broadband as a service is our new type of broadband projects that can be applied for through Power, Arise, and Area Development Funds. It's not for construction, which makes it an easier project to apply for through Arise, because traditional construction projects typically wouldn't be multi-state due to the complexities surrounding the construction nuances for each state and all of those different federal regulations that outline in that. So since it's a non-construction type of project, Arise would be a viable program to apply for in order to fund a broadband as a service project. So a little bit more about the broadband as a service. I know that this one was a pretty highly attended webinar when I was giving the training on that. So if you are interested in seeing the information on that, it is on our website. And we also did send out a link for that training webinar to all the attendees. And if you're interested in getting a copy of that as you weren't available or were not able to attend it, then I can get that to you. It's not a problem. So the broadband as a service, being not for construction, is a procurement process. So the grantee would work with a ISP that would be contracted through a competitive procurement process to serve areas that were identified, or serve locations that were identified pre-application. So a grantee would submit an application to, or an applicant would submit an application to ARC. We would review it for its, competitiveness, for its eligibility and all of that. And if it was a project that we thought would be a good project to fund, then you would be granted the source of funding to then move forward with a procurement or with an RFP to procure broadband as a service from an ISP. But that process does have to be done in a competitive manner, as consistent with 2 CFR 317 through 327, I believe. But all of that is in our BAST training webinar series. So we also have the link there for the broadband as a service. If you would like to take a look at the guidelines there, those were updated pretty recently. So everything within that should be applicable as well. If there's any more specific questions about broadband as a service, feel free to reach out to me. My email is going to be at the end of the slides for my section, and I'm happy to answer any questions particular, because I know it is a kind of different type of project type. So construction projects, those are also a type of project that, again, could be administered through a basic agency, but we would be willing to fund those as well. They are going to be probably more eligible for funding through Power and Area Development Funds in particular. The link for the construction guidelines are also on that slide there. So you should be able to take a look and see the different types of information that would be necessary for construction projects in particular. And then non-infrastructure broadband projects, we've been having a lot of questions about this in relation to digital literacy and digital equity projects. We have funded a couple different digital equity projects and digital device access projects recently. So those are eligible. The tricky thing is with this that it would not necessarily be eligible for the federal DE project through NDIA or program through NDIA right now, since we don't have any open projects or open programs at the moment. So being able to access funding for a digital equity project and use it as a match source for those would not necessarily be eligible right now, since the timelines don't mesh. But we do fund those types of projects in general outside of the digital equity program right now. So keep that in mind if you are not successful in getting any of those funds through NDIA, that ARC also does fund those types of programs or projects. And here's some general application resources I think are pretty helpful when you are looking for information on different projects and different application resources. So just general applicant resources for non-construction projects. I put the link there. Application guidance by project types, that's always super helpful. State partners and basic agency partners are definitely things that you would need to look at, because even if you are not applying for an area development grant and you are still only applying for a Power or an Arise, although they are scored competitively, you still need to get sign off by your state partners there in order to move forward with the application process. We do not fund any projects that are not that we don't get concurrence through our state partners with. So ensuring that you have that good communication is incredibly important because you won't move forward with an application without it. Match calculator, we do have different questions arising about different match rates based on distress. So if you had an at-risk and then a distress county, which one would you have to come up with a match for? And so that match rate calculator is really helpful to determine the match rate that you would have to use for multi-county projects. And then again, the performance measures are necessary in order to determine what will be tracked in the project for the performance outcomes. And that's pretty much all I have right now. Okay, some best tips and practices, sorry. And these are pretty standard processes and practices that I think anybody should be utilizing for projects in general. So planning out the project in detail and working through the application steps to ensure that they are viable, eligible, sustainable, fiscally and financially sound, always an important thing. Getting your funding matches and source prior to applying. Making sure you reach out to your state program manager. This one is an ARC specific, but ensuring that you're working with your state programs managers and your state broadband offices and that they align with the strategic goals is incredibly important. Having a feasibility study done prior to applying for any construction project or even a broadband as a service project is necessary. Reaching out to other anchor institutions, schools, hospital, libraries to get support and help include them in the project development. And then ensuring that the grantee has the capable staff and support the grant management through the life cycle is incredibly important. And I can't stress that enough. Capacity to manage these is incredibly important. Federal grants should not be taken lightly. And there is a lot of loopholes, or not loopholes, but hoops that you have to jump through there in order to ensure that it's a successful one. And the last thing that anybody wants is to have a grant canceled because it was not able to be managed appropriately. So that's about all I have for right now. And if anybody has any questions, okay, it looks like Annie asked a question for a non-deployment project. Do DE projects need to lean on the workforce related metrics to be competitive? For non-deployment ones, we have specific metrics depending on the type of project. So it would really be based on the end outcome or the end goals there. So if it was a workforce related, so if it's workforce development in order to do capacity building, then that would be pertinent for that. But if it's a device access one, then we do have specifics for, access to specific devices. So I'm always happy to help guide people in that because the performance measures can be a little nuanced depending on the type of project. So ensuring that you're looking at what your outcomes and outputs are is really how to match that best. So, or the type of scope is really going to be what drives the outcome. So I'm happy to answer any questions in particular surrounding those. So if you have questions related to that, for a specific project, so Annie, I'd be happy to have a conversation with you about it for the project that you currently have working with us, or if it's a different type of project, I'm happy to have that conversation if you want to shoot me an email.
Thanks so much, Beth. We actually have a few more questions for you, but I'm going to save them for the end of the call. So please stick around, everyone, if you sent me a question. So thanks so much, Beth. And moving on to Tom Reid. Tom, in the last 1 to 2 years, since BEAD has been actively on our radars, it seems like there have been a lot of updates and new information. So please give us an update on what the state of play is for BEAD and any observations, any challenges you've seen, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Great, happy to. Thanks for inviting me to participate. Thanks for everybody for tuning in. So I'm Tom Reid with Reid Consulting Group. We're very fortunate to have a group of clients that give us a 360-degree view of broadband so that we can bring some insights in that benefit from all those different types of clients. So talking about the BEAD timeline, as you'll see in this timeline, we're every 6 months. The states had to do a lot. There's talking about hoops you have to jump through. The states had to jump through quite a few hoops. So there's volume 1 and volume 2 of their BEAD initial proposal. So volume 1, in my mind, the most important thing about it was how are you going to determine which households are eligible and which are not. That was, to me, the real meat in volume 1. And that volume 1 process then a nice set of alphabet soup there, the PCRAN. What that means is first the state had to do pre-challenge modifications. Then they had to operate a challenge process, then a rebuttal process, then an adjudication process, and then package that all up and give it to NTIA. And from what I'm hearing from most states, there's multiple rounds of what they call curing with NTIA. So the idea is each of those steps was supposed to take about 30 days. Some of them are taking longer because of, well, like in Ohio, the rebuttal process opened and then it had to be closed because of a software problem. Then it was opened again. Software problem was still not resolved, so it got closed again, and today it reopened. So it was supposed to be 30 days. It's stretched more, very different from state to state. And then the NTIA curing, apparently sometimes that takes quite a while. So this timeline is very flexible. This is kind of an example of a timeline. You really need to stay in touch with what's happening in your own state from the broadband office. So volume 2, the key point there is how are we going to award grants? What's that grant process look like? How are we going to score them? And that process. And so from the time your volume 2 is approved, you have 365 days to run the grant process. So you've got a year to run the grant process. Now, this is just one example of how the timeline could work out in the state. There's lots of variability, as I mentioned. These NTIA curing timelines, some of them have turned out to be quite long in some states. And you'll see that this 365-day window, it's really important to the states to try to time their approval of volume 2, because if they're still doing the challenge rebuttal process, they are losing parts of that 365-day window. So they want that to line up so that grant process window doesn't start until after they've adjudicated all of the addresses. So feeding in from there, you'll see now we're looking at a timeline that's year by year. So we see that grant process that it will wrap up. Then all that has to be packaged together and sent off to NTIA for your curing process. So that gets submitted as what's called the final proposal. I show that lasting a few months. Hopefully it wouldn't be longer than that, but that curing process is important. And then surprisingly, during the grant process, you're not actually able to cut contracts with the ISP. So you run a grant process, you've awarded it, you can't cut the contracts yet. Those have to be after the NTIA review period. So again, nobody's quite sure how long that's going to take either to negotiate all those contracts kind of after the fact. And then, unfortunately, a lot of these projects are going to get into environmental and historical assessments that are a little unusual. Most of the funding programs recognize categorical exclusions for environmental and historical assessments, that if you're building an existing utility corridors, you know, along pole routes or along the side of a road, most programs just say, do it. Unfortunately, the BEAD program is requiring environmental historical assessments, and a lot of them are going to turn into full environmental impact statements the way things stand right now. Then if you're going in the air, you're going to go on existing poles. You've also got the whole make-ready process to engage in, and that's, you know, some of the pole owners are really cooperative and it goes pretty quickly. Some of the pole owners are not very cooperative, or they just haven't staffed up sufficiently. We're seeing pretty long delays, year and a half sometimes, on getting permission to attach to those poles. So if you're going aerial, you have to conquer that before you can build anything. And then deployment. So based on this forecast, I think in most cases, deployment's not going to start until June 2027. Same 3 points from the previous slide, but then I'm concerned about environmental historical assessments because there's only a certain number of companies that offer those kinds of services. They only have so much capacity. And the make ready, as I mentioned, can take quite a while. So I'm going to focus a little in a minute on these two topics, the environmental historical assessments and the make ready, on things that could be done to improve that process and shorten those timelines. So this is an example of poles in a pretty rural area. And if you're building a middle mile route, you'd pick as many of the green poles as you could. So you can imagine a route going through here, almost all the poles are green. You would avoid areas with the red and orange poles because a red pole is only 30 feet tall. The orange is 35 and the green is 40. The darker green is even taller. So the big issue there is, can you attach fiber below the power and still have clearance to the ground? And in a lot of these cases, the answer would be no, and so you'd be replacing the poles. This is an actual case of a project we worked on. It's in rural Ohio. The terrain's very rugged. The total service area, this is a picture of a small portion of the service area, but the total service area is about 11,000 households and 39,000 poles. And if we built in what they call the communication space, which is 40 inches below the power, we'd be replacing half those poles. So extraordinarily expensive and very time consuming. And if you're replacing more than 20% of the poles, according to current NDIA rules, you'd be doing an entire environmental impact statement on that project. So what we did with this particular project was switch to building the fiber up in the power space. So instead of having to find 40 inches below the power space, actually building up in the power space. And we're only having to replace about 10% of the poles. Well, if you're under 20% of the poles, it's a categorical exclusion. So you're saving money, you're simplifying the environmental historical review process. It's really a win-win if you can talk the pole owner into letting you build in the power space. So the other big reason you want to try to decrease those costs like this is there is a limit. So this is a cost per mile, and I've got it tagged at $100,000. Some people claim they can do it a lot less expensively. Basically, I've got this showing as $60,000 for the actual fiber build and $40,000 a mile for getting those poles ready. So about $100,000 a mile. So it's totally linear. If there's 20 homes per fiber mile, it's costing you $5,000 a home to go past that home. You still have the cost of serving the home, but the cost to pass is what the ISPs really look at as a key metric. If you've only got 5 homes per fiber mile, which is true in a lot of Appalachia, you're at $20,000 per home to pass if you're spending $100,000 a mile. Now I like to take that and say, well, okay, but let's remember this is infrastructure that's going to last for a long time. So if you spread it out over 30 years, even at 5 households per fiber mile, you're talking about $667 per year to provide kind of future-proof technology to that home. And you see, you go back up to that 20 households per mile, you're down to $167 per year. So we think it's still really a fiber-first kind of strategy unless you get into super low population densities. So it's 75% grant, 25% match, which is the requirement for BEAD unless you're deemed in a high cost area. It's 75-25. So go back to that case of 5 households per mile. The grant should be able to pay $15,000. The match would be about $5,000. However, ISPs are typically not willing to spend more than about $3,000 per household. They look for opportunities where they can pass homes at about $1,000, $1,500 per household. Some of them go all the way up to $3,000 per household. So that's kind of their appetite for investment. So anything at $2,500 match and higher, there's a risk that you won't get any bids on it. So bringing those costs down by minimizing the make-ready costs faster and cheaper, you're going to reduce the cases of having no bid. So ways to accelerate. What I'd really like NDIA to do, 2 things. They already adopted a lot of categorical exclusions. I'd like them to adopt a categorical exclusion that says if you're in an existing disturbed right away, and I'm an environmentalist, I think it's really important if you're going across new territory to do an environmental impact statement. But if you're an existing utility corridor, like underneath the power lines, that's getting bush hogged and sprayed with Roundup. And that's the whole point of these utility corridors, is that we can build in them without having any impact. So it would make a really big difference if NDIA would expand their categorical exclusions to say, yeah, if it's disturbed right away, just do it. And we think it's important to focus less on match. There's a lot of focus on match. We think the quality of the network's more important than the match ratio, especially when you look at it, you spread it out over 30 years. You really don't want to be penny wise and pound foolish, basically. The White House, I'd really like to see the White House get the Forest Service to come to the table and accept categorical exclusions. If you're planning a project through Forest Service land, tack at least another year on before you're going to be able to build. It's really difficult process, and they don't have enough staffing to handle the procedures they've created. So it'd be really great if we could get some political support for bringing the Forest Service in line with the categorical exclusions. And then if you can get your electric utilities, rural electric cooperative, IOUs, and investor-owned utilities to really collaborate with the ISPs or even move into that business themselves, really a great win for both parties. You can advance the smart grid requirements of the electric provider, advance the broadband agenda that we all share. One of those ways is you deploy this non-conductive fiber material up in the power space. And if you need to, you can bring those splice cases and terminals down into the communication space, so you don't need a power qualified person to be serving the homes. Really makes a big difference. Proves grid resilience. Most of the rural areas are in population decline because they can't get broadband. This would reverse the population decline. And for the electric utilities, it also increases usage. So that's kind of the BEAD picture. The other piece is we're going to have a lot left to do after BEAD, unfortunately. So the FCC uses a process I call trust but never verify in terms of what's unserved and underserved. Unfortunately, the NTI has adopted the same stance. So if you look at the whole apple as the actual extent of the unserved and underserved, what we've done is let the ISPs have multiple bites at that apple. So they make their filings with the FCC and or in the BEAD challenge process. They say, hey, no, we've already got the service there that meets these benchmarks. Don't go there. And basically we're just, okay, we won't go there. And then the other thing they can do is say, hey, yeah, we know there's no service there, but we're going to build it soon. We're going to build it in the next 12 months. And so that again further reduces eligibility. And the challenge process, I mean, I don't know how many of you tried to engage in the challenge process. It is exceptionally difficult, complex process, and completely unfunded from the citizens' perspective. So it didn't really move the needle in most areas. So unfortunately, after BEAD, there are going to be millions of households across the country that are unserved or underserved still. So we're going to have a lot of work left to do. The other thing, I just can't help debunk some of the crazy claims that people make. So one of them is that fixed wireless can solve these problems, and fixed wireless solves problems, but it's not a ubiquitous solution across the service area. And for instance, if you've got trees, so at 1 gigahertz, you'll go through those leaves, but 1 gigahertz doesn't have much capacity. You go to the higher frequencies to get more capacity, it won't go through the leaves. It just doesn't. It's physics. Doesn't matter how many antennas or what type of antennas, if you're at 5 gigahertz to get the higher capacity, it won't go through the leaves. Can't change the physics of it. I had one congressman tell me, Tom, I get GPS out in the woods. I can get Starlink out in the woods. Well, unfortunately, that's not true either. The GPS is down around 1 gigahertz, so it goes through the leaves. Starlink's much higher frequency. It will not go through even a couple of leaves. So you need a very clear view of the sky for our Starlink. You need an unobstructed view back to the tower for fixed wireless. I know there's also a lot of marketing claims that somehow fixed wireless can go over or around hills. The physics just doesn't support that. All frequencies are stopped by the hill. Starlink too. It won't shoot through the hill or kind of bend over the hill or things like that. It just doesn't happen in real life. So I encourage everybody to keep the long-term perspective. Internet really got rolling about 1990 when www became a thing. And rural America has been in a digital divide ever since then. Way back in the modem days, we couldn't get the same speeds in rural America as you could in the cities. And that's just continued. Every 10 years, the bandwidth that the average urban American can get has gone up by tenfold. So about the time the IIJA passed back in 2021, the average speed that most American households were able to get was about 100 megabits per second. So extend that out, what's going to happen in the future with technology, who knows? But if that curve held up, by 2030, the average would be 1 gigabit. Well, just got a report today that already here in 2024, right about here, we're already at 400 gigabits per second, or 400 megabits per second is the norm in the United States right now. So already we're seeing that there's a lot of places can get 1 gig. There's a number of places that are offering 10 gig or at least multiple gigs. So totally believable to see this trend line continue. It'll probably break at some point. You're really going to have 100 gig to the house? Maybe not, but certainly 10 gig. So when you look at the technologies, fixed wireless and satellite's going to top out a little over 100 meg. Cable modem's going to top out a little over a gig. Fiber today can do 400 gigabits per second. So when you look at the infrastructure planning horizon, you want this to last to 2055. And right now there's only one technology that has the capacity today to meet the needs of 2055, and that's fiber. So I recommend a 10 gig minimum speed, and I'll get off my soapbox after this, that technology neutral is a fine concept as long as that technology will meet the needs of 2055. So be happy to take any questions.
That's a great ending note, Tom. We've had a few questions come in. I'm going to ask one that I see in the Q&A box, which is, does the 12-month grant process requirement for BEAD begin at NOFO release?
No, it begins at the NDIA approval of the initial proposal, volume 2. That's when it starts.
Thank you. And then maybe I'll slip one more in before we call on Aaron. Do ISPs need to submit a broadband consumer label with their application?
I wouldn't be surprised to see that happen. So the grant application process, again, is defined state by state and submitted in their volume 2 initial proposal. That labeling requirement is going to be there whether it's in the state proposal or not, because of the FCC requirements. So those labels are coming one way or another.
Okay. And then maybe I'll just slip one more question in as Aaron is coming on video. Is the ISP contracting with the state or NDIA?
I believe the way it's going to work in most situations is the state is the recipient and the ISP is a subrecipient.
Okay. Thanks so much, Tom. We'll have Tom back. We have a few more questions here. We'll have him back at the end of the call. Thanks, Tom.
Thanks.
And last but not least, welcome Aaron. As the lead association for digital equity in the US, I know NDIA has been very busy in the last few weeks analyzing, decoding, and fielding all questions Digital Equity Program Act and its subsequent programs. Please give us an overview of what you've learned and any advice you might have for communities and organizations pursuing these grants. Thanks, Aaron.
Sure. Thanks, Sarah. I'm happy to be here. Hi, everyone. And I'm here today to talk about the Digital Equity Act funding programs. For those who are not familiar with NDIA and myself, we're a national nonprofit that serves a community of now over 1,800 affiliates doing digital inclusion work in communities all across the country. And I'm Aaron. I'm the Director of Research and Programs. So I oversee our data and research work, as well as our support for local communities, local governments, and other community partners. So happy to be here today. What we're going to cover in the next 15 or so minutes is a key overview of the Digital Equity Act programs, and then specifically the State Capacity Grant Program and the Competitive Grant Program. There's a lot to cover, so I'm going to move through things quickly. Just know that these slides will be available. I will add in some additional slides that I don't have time to talk about today, but that will give you some key program requirements and things to think about. So please feel free to spend some more time looking at the slides when we share those. So first, just some orientation. The Digital Equity Act program, there are 3 programs. All of the states completed statewide planning grant program. So now every state has a digital equity plan for the state. And states are now moving into the State Capacity Grant Program, which I will touch on briefly. So that's $1.44 billion available to states to implement their digital equity plans. Simultaneously, NTIA, the federal agency administering the Digital Equity Act, just launched the Competitive Grant Program, which is a national program, and I will get to that second. So first, let's talk a little bit about the State Capacity Grant Program. Year 1 allocations were announced earlier this year, and in all, NTIA is releasing about 60% of that $1.44 billion to states for year 1 allocations. So this is all of the states that are covered by ARC. So find your state on here and you'll see about how much money, approximately how much is available for the year 1 allocation for your state. So I'll give folks a moment to find their state. Okay, so some key things to know. NTIA released the first capacity award to the state of Nevada in June. Most states currently have their application for the funding that you just saw, however much that was. So, for example, West Virginia has about $9 million. States have submitted their applications to NTIA for that, and most states are waiting to hear back. They're in a curing process and waiting to receive their funding. But we expect most, if not all, states to have that by the end of 2024. What's important to know is from the date the state receives their award, they have 9 months to submit a final list of projects to NTIA. So basically how they're going to use all of the funding they have available for their year 1 allocation, including subawards. So states will be administering a lot of their programs and this funding themselves, but they also have the option to do subgrants. So putting the plan into action, using those funds, there are a few things that your state will need to keep in mind. They need to make sure that they're focusing on the covered populations. We've talked a lot about covered populations for those who are part of the accelerator program. The more detailed, the full slide deck that I'll share out will have a list of the covered populations also. States also need to ensure that their strategies are measurable and can be evaluated. NTIA is really encouraging lasting, sustainable change. So we want to see how there will be sustainability built into this. And finally, engaging with and consulting with community members and other key stakeholders is critical. As I mentioned, states can choose, and many are, to have sub-award programs where they will make subgrants to local governments, to community-based organizations, to many of you all on this call, I'm sure are thinking about or talking to your state about the potential to be a subawardee for their state capacity grant program. So essentially, states can choose to support implementation of their plan by using a portion of the funds for this. And what they fund needs to still align with what's in their plan. So that's really important to be familiar with and be looking at. Just to give an idea of a few things that you can be thinking about as you consider partnering with your state or applying for subgrant funds. We put out a blog post a month or 2 ago now. I don't remember the exact date, but you can find a link to it in the slides on how to prepare a competitive application. So some things to think about when you're considering your own subgrant proposal. You'll want to make sure that you read and are very familiar with your state's digital equity plan and connect with the administering entity, basically the state digital equity staff or broadband office, to understand kind of what their plans are and what the timeline looks like. Can't give a lot of details on timeline now because it will be a little bit different for each state. And as I mentioned before, most states are still waiting for their funds. So it'll be really important for you to coordinate with and be in touch with your state broadband office to receive updates on timing. What you can do is begin to gather important federal forms. So all federal grants require 424 forms, which you can find at that link, and for you to have a unique entity ID or UEI, which you can register for from sam.gov. And you'll hear me mention that in a moment again when we move on to the competitive grant program. So let's talk about the National Competitive Grant Program. So again, this is $1.25 billion that is happening simultaneous to the state capacity grant program. And this program is being administered by NDIA directly and is a nationwide competitive grant application process. So of that $1.25 billion in this first year, $750 million are available. They're trying to free up another $250 million to also make available this year. That's still kind of TBD if that will be available at the same time. But we know at a minimum, $750 million will be available through a NOFO that was released in July of this year. And applications are due in about 3 weeks. So September 23rd is when competitive grant applications are due. So if you are thinking about this, yesterday is the time to get going and start planning your application, whether you'll be a lead applicant or potentially a partner on another organization's application. So awards generally will be between $5 and $12 million, although it is possible to go above or below that, but it would require an explanation. NDIA wants to get this money out quickly, so they expect to start issuing awards at the end of this year, and no later than, they're hoping to get it out by the end of this year, but no later than April of next year is when awards will start going out, and then they'll continue on an ongoing basis. And what we've heard generally is they're anticipating somewhere in that neighborhood of 150 to 200 awards. So who can apply for this? Many of you all on the call, most of your organizations are eligible to apply. So political subdivisions, so basically local governments, including public housing authorities, libraries, other subdivisions of the state government are eligible to apply. Tribal communities are eligible. That third bullet, foundations, corporations, institutions, and associations that are nonprofits and not a school. Essentially, that means nonprofit organizations. So foundations, community-based organizations, nonprofits are eligible. Community anchor institutions, so I mentioned libraries, universities are eligible. Local educational agencies, which are like school districts, essentially. And you see a couple of others there, are all eligible to apply. And what's eligible? Essentially almost any digital inclusion activities. So you see, I won't read through these now, you can look at them in more detail, but essentially the kind of digital inclusion activities that come to mind, skills, devices, helping people access internet services are all eligible activities. Because there's a lot of money to get out the door, and because these will be relatively large grants, NDIA is encouraging partnerships. So we strongly encourage to think about either being a lead applicant and engaging with partners, or partnering with maybe an organization with the capacity to manage a large federal grant. So that's being encouraged. Each partner organization will need to submit a letter of commitment and will need to be named in the application. So you'll want to, if you have not confirmed partners or are thinking about being a partner, you'll want to do that very quickly. There's also match required. So NDIA is, the guidelines essentially say a minimum of a 10% match, although you may submit for a waiver. I would not bank on that being guaranteed. Match can be a combination of cash or in-kind contributions. There's also additional bonus points awarded for higher levels of match. So if you can achieve 20% or 30% or more match, there are some additional points to be won, but kind of the standard that NDIA is looking for is at least 10%. So in thinking about what should go into applications and what would make for a competitive application, you will need to focus on serving covered populations. You will actually need to estimate how many members of different covered populations will be served. So you would estimate a total number of people to be served, and then we'll need to break that out by covered populations. Intersectionality is a key consideration. So community members can obviously be part of more than one covered population. And so you'll want to think about kind of how you're crossing covered populations and making those estimates. Sustainability is a real key. The application has sections where you need to discuss how this program will be sustainable beyond the life of the Digital Equity Act funding. So thinking about what will be the lasting effects and how will this work continue? Obviously needs to be measurable, and a key piece consideration is also innovation and community engagement. So thinking about how you're engaging stakeholders, NTIA is wanting to see how you will engage community members and stakeholders throughout the process. And they'll want to see how you're innovative and ensuring that you're not duplicating existing efforts that are already out there. So here are a few kind of considerations that NTIA will be making as they review programs. So will you improve internet access and adoption for covered populations, again, through digital skills training, through technical assistance, through devices, as well as internet access? They'll want to see diversity across the country. So are you serving a diverse range? Are you partnered with multiple different communities, potentially even multi-state applications? They'll want to ensure that historically underserved areas like Appalachia are well represented, so that bodes well for applications from Appalachia. Again, they'll want to make sure that you're not duplicative with other existing efforts. In particular, they are focused on not duplicating with state capacity grant programs or what's in the state plan. So if you can show that what you're doing is complementary to the state's efforts and to the state plan, but is not duplicating, that'll be really important. And then, of course, needs to be in line with the grant requirements that NTIA has laid out. A few other areas, so they're looking at aligned industries and areas to have impact. So to the extent you can show that you're making impact around workforce development, access to education, healthcare, these kind of aligned industries will be a real key focus of theirs. And so what should you be doing now? Got a lot of to-do list items for you. So again, you can go back and look at this. There are links to all of these things, so I don't expect everyone to internalize these all now. But first and foremost, read the NOFO. There's a lot of information. NTIA did a really fantastic job of providing details in the NOFO itself. Of course, there will be questions and clarifications needed. We put out a webinar that you can go back and watch on YouTube. NTIA also has a lot of great application guidance. They have their own webinar series, which is linked here. They also have an email address set up specifically to answer questions for this. So please feel free to reach out to them directly. And they are regularly updating their FAQ page, which is linked here. Additionally, a couple other homework items. This is the second time I'm mentioning, if you don't have one, get your unique entity identifier through sam.gov. That can take a little time, so please don't wait. Again, work on your partnerships, review your state's digital equity plan, check out NTIA's resources. Get started early. Do not wait until the last minute to begin preparing the application materials. They are substantial, and everything needs to be into the grants portal by the 23rd. There are no exceptions, and so we encourage folks to get started early, if you have not already. So don't wait till the last minute to submit your materials. And with that, I think we are ready to potentially answer a few questions.
Thanks, Aaron. I'll ask the other speakers to come on camera, so I'll also shoot some questions to you all before we close. So for Aaron, I think we have time for about 2 or 3 questions. So first one, is the state passing down measurable metrics, or do applicants create their own? So if they're applying for funding.
Yeah, great question. So for the state capacity grant program, the state has identified what is called measurable objectives, and they have key performance indicators and targets identified in the state digital equity plan. So when we say read the plan, that's essentially, you have the answer key to what the state is looking to fund. For the competitive program, it is still really useful to look at what your state has identified as needs, because they've looked at what the needs are in the state. And so you will need to come up with your own metrics and measures of success for a competitive grant program, but you can get some really good ideas from the state's digital equity plan of kind of what some of those needs might be.
Thanks. And finally, if you have any general advice, also please close with this. But if you ask for the waiver for match, will that weigh in on your application? Could this be judged against you?
Ooh, that's a tough question, and that is one that I would direct you to NTIA, either their existing guidance, which again is linked in one of those last couple slides, or you could email them directly. So I'm not going to answer that directly. I'm going to dodge it a little bit, but I will say they're very clear about that they are looking for a 10% match, and they are very clear that they are awarding additional bonus points for if you can hit a 20 or 30% threshold. So match is a key consideration. I will say that the more match you can include, the stronger it will count. They have not specifically said that not hitting that 10% would count against you, but again, this is going to be a very competitive application process. And so those that are able to bring those higher levels of match will certainly be more competitive. Reminder, that can be a combination of in-kind and cash match. So be creative in how you're thinking about what might count as in-kind match.
I second that, just coming from the, funding entity side of things, that getting creative with the in-kind match is really, really helpful. We understand that a lot of these entities are already strapped and that cash can be a tight thing to come by. So getting creative with where the money can come from and how it's going to flow in is super important, and that you can be flexible with that. So.
Thanks, Erin. For Beth, I have 2 questions for you, and then please also include any final words you might have for folks. So can you apply to Power and Arise in the same year? And for multi-state projects, do all states need to be under the ARC?
So yes and yes. You can apply. We have plenty of applicants that are current grantees, and lots of grantees that apply for, more than one application in a year. So yes. And the second part is that every state has to be within ARC territory. You can include other entities within a separate, it could be a separate, project within the same overall scope of things, but the only thing that we will fund are eligible territories within ARC.
Okay. Thanks, Beth, for joining us. And for Tom, we'll end with you. So I have a few questions I've compiled. Maybe this is a little controversial, but what will a state broadband office do if there are no bids on an unserved area?
Yeah, good question. I think there's going to be a number of creative approaches they try to take. One thing is to pretend Starlink will reach them. That's one possible outcome. They're going to try to negotiate with ISPs that are going to build adjoining areas, try to get them to pick those up. If they can't get anybody, I don't know what NDIA is going to do, because that's the gating function, is you're supposed to reach every unserved location. If the state just can't do that, I'm not sure what's going to happen at that point.
Thanks, Tom. Really want to thank the 3 of you for joining us today. Thank you so much for imparting your wisdom. We'll be sending folks the recording of this webinar and the slide deck. In the slide deck, we'll make sure to put in some extra research on a few state-specific funding mechanisms. And if you know of anything that's missing, please let me know and we can add it. I also want to remind folks that of 2 program resources we have. One is the BEAD tracker that ILSR has been tracking. I put it in the chat box. We also have a prospect funders list that has some foundations on it that are either located in or have funded projects in Appalachia. This was created for the last funding webinar with Beth and Erica Mesker from Connect Humanity. I'll put this also here. If you have any further questions on the opportunities that you've heard about today, please shoot me an email or shoot our speakers an email. Once again, thank you, Beth, Tom, and Erin for speaking, and for all of you for joining us today. That concludes our webinar. Thanks everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.